Good day to everybody who's joined us so far for the monthly Conexxus webinar. We'll get started very shortly. Thanks to those of you that are joining the monthly Conexxus webinar. We will get started here in just another minute. Thanks for standing by. It looks like we still have a few folks that are joining here, so we'll get started in just a few more seconds. Thanks for standing by. Okay, good day, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started, and welcome to the monthly Conexxus webinar series. Today, we're going to have a presentation on the roadmap to a vulnerability disclosure program by Joe Basarico. Next slide. Our agenda, I'll go over a few housekeeping items. I'll talk a little bit more about our presenter, a little bit about Conexxus. We'll have the presentation, and then we'll have question and answer session at the end. Just as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. It will be made available in approximately 30 days on YouTube, and you can subscribe to Conexxus on YouTube so that you can see all of the latest and greatest webinars that are happening there. You can also go to conexxus.org, and there's a website link there. A little while after the presentation has concluded today, there will be a survey link. You'll receive an email with a survey link. It's just a few short questions, just asking you how you like the survey, or excuse me, how you like the presentation, and if you have suggestions for future webinars. And then once you complete the survey, there will be a link to the presentation. And then also, participants are in listen-only mode. And so therefore, if you do have a question, we ask that you use the GoToWebinar question panel that's on your screen. We do ask that you keep the questions somewhat of a generic nature and ask no vendor-specific questions. If you do have any further comments, please feel free to email Conexxus at info@conexxus.org. Today, our Conexxus host is Allie Russell, so thank you, Allie, for being behind the scenes and all the logistics here and sending out the notifications. I'm Cara Gunderson. I'm your moderator today. I'm the chairman of the Data Security Committee for Conexxus, and during the day, I'm the point of sale manager at Citgo Petroleum. We're very happy to have Joe Basarico from Security Innovation today, and he brings a wealth of knowledge and years of experience for data security and the likes thereof. A little bit about Conexxus. So if you're not familiar with us, we are an independent, nonprofit, member-driven technology organization. So for instance, there's very few staff members. It is really, really fueled by the members themselves. Like for instance, Joe is a volunteer and I'm a volunteer. And the Conexxus actually sets standards for data exchange security, such things as mobile commerce. And that helps all of us that we can use the same technology standards regardless of which point of sale system that we're using, back office providers in our industry. It's just a great, great organization. And Conexxus provides a vision for identifying emergent technology and trends, as we'll talk about today. And definitely Conexxus is an advocate for industry. this is our webinar schedule for this year for a few more months. Next month, we will have moving toward outdoor EMV, be some best practices for implementing outdoor EMV. I think we're getting closer and closer to that full release within our industry. Linda Toth from Conexxus, who is a Conexxus staff member, will be leading that charge along with some other volunteers from the fuel dispenser manufacturers. On September 20th, we'll have George from Omega talk about the systems that are talking to you. And then we're very lucky to have Joe back with us in November to talk about building a scalable security engineering team. Now, I would note that we do not have a webinar in October because we like to remind everybody that NACS is in October. And speaking of NACS, Conexxus hosts the Tech Edge series within the NACS show, which is October 7th through 10th in Las Vegas. So if you've not registered, please feel free to do so, and don't forget to book your hotel. Many thanks to our 2018 Conexxus sponsors. So now I'm going to turn it over to Joe. So thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Cara. So yeah, let's get started. So I appreciate everybody for being here. And as Cara mentioned, I'll be talking to you today about creating a vulnerability disclosure program. And kind of what's more important than that is how we get there, kind of getting all of our ducks in the row. We'll be talking about bug bounty programs a little bit as well, but really it's about creating a plan from where you are now and working with your software vendors, partners, and everybody that's kind of in your whole software and device supply chain, and getting them all on board with this concept of security researchers discovering security vulnerabilities in software and hardware, and then how they actually let you know about those things as they discover them. So I've split it into essentially 6 sections. I'll create, kind of go over a security maturity timeline. This is a rough timeline and order of priority that I think is important to start with. I'll talk a little bit about bug bounty programs, some of the pros and cons. Then I'll talk about kind of getting into the minds of a security researcher. Kind of news flash, security researchers aren't your normal engineer, and they definitely think a little differently and want to be treated a little differently. And then the 4th section is all about rolling out your vulnerability disclosure program, whether that's rolling one out for yourself because you are creating software internally, or for working with other software and device manufacturers, so that you can work with them to work through their vulnerability disclosure program. Then the second one, the 5th one, I guess, is internal and external messaging. So how do you work within your organization to organize and prioritize all of these things? And then how do you actually communicate that plan out to the world so that security researchers know how to communicate to you? And then finally, we'll put it all together in a nice, put a nice little bow on it. So as I mentioned, the first thing that I want to talk about is this application security maturity timeline. Now, this is relatively software focused, but I think that there's a lot of pieces here that you can kind of pick and choose depending on your needs. So if you're not an organization that builds your own software or builds your own devices, there's still a lot of good pieces here, just depending on how you implement those things. So the first thing that I think is table stakes for any vulnerability disclosure program is just the initial creation. And this is kind of interesting. It might sound like I'm putting the cart before the horse. How can I create a vulnerability disclosure program if I don't even know what a vulnerability disclosure program is? And what I'm saying here is this is your first stab, right? This is your first attempt at creating a process by which a security researcher can tell you about security vulnerabilities. Now, security researchers in their core stumble across these issues. I myself have stumbled across security vulnerabilities in numerous different systems. And generally, what I want to do with that security vulnerability is to tell the vendor about it, to tell somebody who can actually fix it. So the first thing that I'll try to do is actually go to the website or try to interact with that organization in some way so that I can get that remediated. Now, the important part here is without a initial vulnerability disclosure program, I don't know how to do that. And this can be very frustrating to security researchers. So simply doing the bare minimum table stakes of having a website, one web page, having an email that is security@yourorganization.com, those kinds of things can really take good steps toward how you end up interacting with security researchers. Now, once you've created that kind of framework, the next thing you'll want to do is create a scan. Use a tool to do an automated scan. And what I'm talking about here is simply to do a scan across your organization, and that could be a network scan, could be a software scan, just to get your arms around what the overall landscape of your security maturity looks like. This can be relatively eye-opening, even though it's an automated scan. We've had a lot of our customers come back and say, oh my goodness, like we had no idea about security. We ran that tool that you asked us to run, and here's the list. It's as long as my arm about all the issues that I found. Help us, prioritize and remediate those things. So that's a good first step. You definitely want to do that before doing something like rolling out a bug bounty program where you're going to invite the entire world to attack you. Now, after the automated scan, you're really picking the low-hanging fruit and remediating whatever you can there. After that, you want to get an external assessment. Now, what this is a team of security professionals that come in and assess similar scope to what you just scanned. Now, the difference is that these security professionals are going to use more complicated, more specific tools. They're going to use very sophisticated methodologies in order to attack your system, more like a real live attacker would. Now, this could be any number of different attacks. It could be physical attacks at the pump. It could be network attacks against a point of sale system. It could be a general network scan that looks at your organization as a whole. It could be a software assessment. The scope is really dependent on what's concerning to you, but the important part is that you're engaging with an organization that employs these professionals. Now, after this, we'll want to get you some security training. We just showed you all of the kind of skeletons in your closet and all the warts everywhere. We want to make sure that you're not going to be doing that anymore. So going through some security training on how to configure things, how to enable security features, how to roll out security features, or how to develop software securely is your next phase. Now, obviously, you're all here, so you're all interested in security training, and that's awesome. But rolling that security training out to the rest of your organization is also really important. Sometimes the security training just takes the is essentially just security awareness, so people know how to set passwords and not be click on phishing emails and things like that. But sometimes it can be more complicated as well. Now, that's table stakes. Those are the first 4 things that you're going to want to do that I think every organization needs to do just to kind of enter into the general maturity security landscape. Now, after that, what you're going to want to do is look internally. So internally, you're going to define your own coordination and messaging. So what happens when a security researcher communicates to you and says, hey, I found this security issue. I want you to go and tell me about it, tell me more information about it, and fix it. How are you going to communicate with that? What kind of framework, timeline, and things like that will you define for them? Now, we're going to get into that piece more as we get into the slide deck a little further, but overall, that's what we're going to look for. After that, you might want to do your own bug bash. Now, what I mean by this is asking your own employees to look at your systems from a security perspective. Now, in software, this is the concept of having literally everyone on the team look for security vulnerabilities for some period of time, a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. But for different organizations, this can take a different form. So this might be, asking some of your network operations engineers or some of your SOC folks to take a look at your systems from, from a security perspective and go through component by component and fix all of the issues that they can find, or configure the different devices in a secure fashion. Really spend some time shoring up the security of your system. Now, after that, you may want to create your own security team. Now, this could be just a single person that's in charge of knowing about security threats against your organization, or it could be a more robust, larger team. Starting out with a single person that then can do that initial research to know how big that team needs to be, identifying someone like a CISO, or just a security lead against your team might be a good first step here. Now that you've done some scanning, done an external assessment, done some security training, you've put together internal messaging and coordination, you've done a bug bash, and you've created a security team, you're feeling a little bit better, now's the time to go back to that vulnerability disclosure program and revise it. So this is an opportunity for you to say, okay, based on everything we've learned so far, our security landscape, our controls in place, our messaging, all of that kind of things, this is really how we want to be interacted with. So now we're going to revise that vulnerability disclosure program and re-release it. These kinds of things, especially that second revision, that second release of your vulnerability disclosure program, might even be press worthy, right? So you might want to even create a press release so that security researchers and people know that you're taking this stuff seriously. Now, after that, creating a security gap analysis, or doing a security gap analysis, can be really important. Now, this is where you might engage an external vendor, or attempt to do this on your own. But this is where you engage an external vendor to go through all of your processes. Now, these are things like how you implement new devices or integrate them with different things, or if you're building software, how you actually build that software in a secure fashion. They'll come in, look at that entire process, and then help you improve the process. So you're doing the right security things at the right security time. This can be really, it can save you a lot of time in the long run. Kind of getting that out in the open, getting it done is really important. Now that you've done all these things, it might be a good idea to get another security assessment from another external vendor, or do some tabletop exercises. Tabletop exercises, I kind of joke that it's kind of like D&D or Dungeons and Dragons for cybersecurity. So essentially, it's just a game where your red team or somebody internally creates what-if scenarios, or you utilize an external vendor to create these what-if scenarios. So, okay, what if you discover that there's a massive vulnerability in your card reader that allows an attacker to steal credit cards in real time? How are you going to handle that? Who are you going to talk to? How are you going to coordinate with your other vendors and communicate with folks? If you discover that a security researcher sends you an email that says, I'm sitting on the world's biggest vulnerability, you've got 5 days to fix it or else. How are you going to handle that? How are you going to coordinate and work with them? So these tabletop exercises are just these what-if scenarios to test out your own process. And so it's really important to kind of think through that and think about how you might react and who you need to coordinate with. And then finally, after doing all of those things, this is where we're going to release a bug bounty program, if we're going to release a bug bounty program. Now, a bug bounty program sounds a little crazy, but essentially you're inviting security researchers to attack you. And essentially the clause is, if you attack us and you find a security issue, we'll pay you for it. But you gotta kind of follow our rules. And I'll talk a little bit more about a bug bounty program later, but essentially, it's an open agreement with security researchers to allow them to find issues and feel comfortable giving you that information and potentially getting a reward. Now, the reward might be monetary, it might be something else, but again, we'll get to that in a little bit. Now here, I want to talk about a few of what I call like the key organizational security maturity components. Now, the first one here, reactive guidance and proactive training. So that reactive guidance is creating those methodologies, creating those documents and frameworks so that you know how to react to a security breach, a security researcher telling you about a vulnerability, and some of these other security components. So you actually need to have these playbooks and generate them beforehand so that you know how to handle these things. Now, second, we need some proactive training. Before this attack or breach or disclosure happens, we want to know how to handle that. And so that's that proactive training. Now, your security team might be at the more formal level, a CISO, and they're in charge of the security across your entire organization, both application, network, and physical. Or it can be something a little bit less formal. Sometimes we hire folks that go by the title security guru or security czar. I have a friend that works at Twitter, and her title formally is the security unicorn. And so these titles can be more or less formal, but the purpose is the same. This is the single person whose job it is to really think about your organization from a security perspective, identify risks, and mitigate those. Now, they may also be in charge of hiring and maintaining a security review team or a risk assessment team to understand how your organization is standing against some of these other attacks. I think that doing a regular external assessment is really important, similar to the way that any author would never publish a book without having an editor read it. You never want to publish or launch a network or a device or a piece of software without having an external vendor look at it. It's not because you don't know these issues and couldn't do this. It's because you're just like the author, you're kind of blinded by creating it yourself. So the same assumptions that you use to create the system, you're going to apply to the assessment. And of course, there's compliance and data risk categorization and discovery, and there's all of the different compliance and regulations that the industry has kind of placed upon it. Those are also really important to think about and organize. So I think about when we're looking at creating a secure system, there are essentially three different components: the tools we want to use, the assessments that we want to do, and then the vulnerability disclosure program. Now, there's three pieces here that kind of fit together for a good security perspective, security view of all of these things. Now, tools are great. They're inexpensive. They're quick to execute. They're repeatable. You can run them yourselves. They miss a lot of issues. They generate a lot of false positives, and sometimes they can be kind of time consuming to configure. But again, the cost is a main attractor to tools. Doing a manual assessment is kind of the other end of the spectrum, right? You're going to swing that pendulum all the way to the other side. So you're going to get a very thorough, very custom assessment against your network or devices. It's going to give you great risk perspective. It's going to give you really good viewpoint of what to fix in what order and how bad it could be. All of that kind of stuff is going to be in a manual assessment. However, they're relatively time consuming and quite costly. So you may not want to jump into the assessment if you haven't already gone through some tooling and training and done your own gotten your house in order a little bit. Now, the vulnerability disclosure program fits in with both of the other things, tools and assessments, because what you're actually going to get is kind of a bimodal distribution of vulnerabilities being disclosed to you. What I mean by that is that a lot of security researchers are potentially not as well trained as some others, and they're going to be finding and scanning for your basic issues, basic misconfiguration issues, and things like that. Those are great to shore up and certainly important to do, but they can be, if you haven't run tools or done an assessment, those can be very time consuming and a lot to manage. On the other end of the spectrum, you may also find professional security researchers that do this as a job. And they're spending a lot of their time digging deep into your network or the software that you use, or the devices that you use, and they might put together some very, very complicated and very interesting critical issues that you want to fix. Oddly, there's not a lot in the middle. You have people that are really, really good at finding really low-level, interesting vulnerabilities, and people that do wild kind of scanning, basic scanning, but not a lot in the middle. So it's also important to, if you're going to roll out a bug bounty program, it's really important to do it properly. Now, this is a quick story about how DJI, they're a drone, a quadcopter drone company out of China, and they made a huge deal out of releasing this great bug bounty program. They set their top bug bounty reward at $30,000, and they're really, really proud of it. This person, and you can click the link later, but this person essentially found a critical vulnerability in the way these devices were configured and some of the data that he could get off of them, and it's a kind of interesting write-up about how that worked. When he disclosed it to DJI, they actually just gave pushback, and they said, oh, that's not a vulnerability, or we're not going to fix that. Over time, they didn't pay the bounty at all, and I think toward the end, they even threatened legal repercussions. And at the end, he said, you know what, it's not worth my time to do this. And he wrote up a blog post, or an article on everything that he did, every interaction that he had with DJI, and essentially how you can reproduce the vulnerability yourself, and published it on the internet for all to see. Now, this is a critical example of how not to do such a thing, right? So working with security researchers, and I'll talk about this in a later slide, working with security researchers so that they feel heard and they feel respected is really, really important. Now, bug bounty programs, this is where we invite security researchers to attack us, and then we reward them with monetary or other rewards. There's some pros and cons, so let's go over those. So on the pros and strengths side, we're getting a lot of eyes on our systems. It can be really, really powerful with the right incentives. It can really invite the right people to look at our software, and if we create a good process for that, it can be really smooth. They're really getting popular. A lot of organizations are rolling them out, and security researchers are expecting bug bounty programs to be there, or at least a vulnerability disclosure program, some sort of framework by which to communicate vulnerabilities to an organization. It is getting expected. And you can see that over the last few years, since 2013, we've seen public bug bounty programs grow kind of linearly over the last few years. About 100 organizations are registered with BugCrowd right now. BugCrowd is a third-party broker that allows you to kind of roll these bug bounty programs and disclosure programs out. But private bug bounty programs, these are bug bounty programs where you don't invite just everyone to attack you, but you invite security researchers that you know and can sort of trust to attack your systems. Now, this can be a really good opportunity to kind of control the stem of different disclosures that you're going to get. And you can see that they're getting more popular even than public bug bounty programs. And we've got about a couple hundred of them as of 2016 in BugCrowd. It's even gotten more popular than that in recent times. Now, there are a number of weaknesses. It can be overwhelming. I think it's BugCrowd that published these statistics that I have at the bottom right here. They say in the first 2 weeks, researchers will find 5 critical vulnerabilities, 70 unique vulnerabilities, and 200 vulnerabilities. Now, that's incredible, right? Like, you might read that and say, oh, wow, that's great. I want to hear about those 5 critical vulnerabilities against my network or against my system or whatever. I want to fix those 70 unique vulnerabilities against my system. But I can also read that in the opposite way. The first thing is that you're going to receive 200 vulnerabilities in 2 weeks. That's 100 vulnerabilities a week that you're going to have to triage and understand and plan for. Of those 200 vulnerabilities, 130 of them will be duplicates that you're going to throw away. 70 of them are unique vulnerabilities that you're going to have to triage and understand how to handle. Of those 70, 5 are going to be important for you to fix. So if you don't do the legwork up front to make sure that your low-hanging fruit issues, your basic configuration, your basic integration issues aren't fixed, you're going to get a lot of invalid or overwhelming report submissions. If you roll out a vulnerability disclosure program or a bug bounty program and you're not able to keep up with the responses in a timely fashion, that can open you up to poor publicity and things like that. So we definitely want to kind of scope this out and roll it out appropriately and properly. So in conclusion, important part of a vulnerability disclosure program is to roll it out when you're prepared. Make sure that you've got your ducks in a row and then roll that out. So let's talk a little bit about what security researchers want. First and foremost, respect, right? They are spending their time relatively free. They're not they may not be getting paid for this time. They may not be expecting any payment, and they're essentially giving you free testing, right? So their motivations can vary, of course. Some people like publicity. Some people just want to make the world a safer place. Some people want to test out their skills, but they're usually not malicious. If they were malicious, they could do much worse things with the vulnerabilities than tell you about the issues. So first and foremost, security researchers want your respect. So thank you for submitting this vulnerability to us. We'll get right on it and communicate with them throughout. Second, yes, they do want rewards, right? So these can, we're gonna talk about this later, but this can be all kinds of different things. It might be a t-shirt, it might be a hat, it might be actual cash, it might be an interview opportunity. We'll talk about this later, but lots of different potential rewards. They want to see results. They're telling you about this vulnerability because they care, right? Because they want to know that you take the security concern seriously. And so as they tell you about a vulnerability, don't drop the ball. Don't say, oh, thanks for submitting that, and then never talk to them again. Follow up. Let them know when the issue will be resolved, if they need to verify the fix, or if they're going to receive a reward when that's going to happen. So definitely set their expectations for progress and response. Kind of be an active participant in this. That's important. And finally, security researchers also really like recognition, right? So not all of them, but doing things like public messaging of the disclosure. So having some sort of, maybe just a blog post or a Twitter tweet or something that says, hey, we appreciate so-and-so for disclosing this vulnerability responsibly to us, and we're fixing it, and all of that kind of thing. They also want to know how and when you'll let your users know about the issue. So when can they see their work kind of get into the real world? When can they kind of say, oh, okay, I helped fix that issue? We'll talk about this a little bit later, but there are all kinds of different ways to recognize security researchers. Now, this is kind of an interesting slide, I think, because we're going to talk a little bit about the power dynamic between security researchers and organizations that want to hear about these security vulnerabilities. Now, on one end of the spectrum, you could say that security researchers kind of hold all of the power, right? They're finding a vulnerability, and what they do with that is up to them. So on one end of the spectrum, I suppose, there's the no disclosure route, where they don't tell anybody about it until they sell it on the black market, dark web or something. Okay, you want to steal a bunch of credit cards from such and such vendor, here's the step-by-step, here's the tool you'd use. And they're going to go through and they're going to sell it to the highest bidder, and you won't hear about it until it's been out in the wild for months or potentially years. That's kind of your worst case scenario. You definitely don't want that to happen. The next ratchet up is open disclosure. Now, this is where you hear about it the same time everybody else hears about it. This can be very stressful. So this is where the security researcher doesn't tell anybody about anything at all. and then they do all this research. They find a security issue. They write up the bug bug report as a blog post. They publish it to the internet, and they submit it to all of their favorite technical websites. Oh man, look at this issue that I just found in this point of sale system, and look at what you could do rolling up to this gas station or something like that. That would be relatively bad. It's not as bad as somebody selling it on the black market, but it's definitely not a good scenario, not a good look for you. And so how you handle that, that's a good scenario to add to your tabletop exercises. Now, the best case scenario is what we call this responsible disclosure piece. So when we find vulnerabilities at Security Innovation, because we do stumble across them, this is what we follow: a practice of responsible disclosure. So essentially, the way this works is we write up the bug report. We try to get in communication with the vendor, understand their business, their timelines, how work with them to get this fixed, and things like that. And then that's it for us. So we never disclose anything ever. Other security researchers do want to write up a blog, but they'll give you enough time to fix the issue so that they can write up the technical post only after you've had a time to fix that. So when a security researcher comes to you and talks about, hey, I found this issue, and it's important to fix this, and this is how I would do it, blah blah blah. It's important to ask, are you planning on disclosing this publicly? Is it ever going to be released? What's the timeline? Is that a hard timeline? Are you going to release this no matter what in 2 weeks? Or is that negotiable as long as we're making forward progress? Is that a negotiable timeline? A good example of this is, I found this blog post on this security researcher that found a pretty critical vulnerability on how this bank, Norwegian bank, leaked balance numbers for all of the customers' bank accounts. And pretty big deal, but he responsibly disclosed the vulnerability to the bank, walked them through what the issue was. They were super responsive, and it actually ended up fixing the issue in a couple of hours, so that this security researcher could then go back and verify the fix, and then everybody was safer. So that's kind of the best case scenario. A worst case scenario is what happened to Instagram a little while ago. So Instagram rolled out a bug bounty program. They asked all of the security researchers to find security issues, and through a relatively long back and forth, from December 16th of 2015 all the way to like almost a year later, there's a lot of communication back and forth from this security researcher and Alex Stamos, who is the CISO of Facebook. And at the end, the researcher just felt like Facebook wasn't taking this seriously. Alex Stamos wasn't being nice to the security researcher. So instead of working with Instagram and Facebook to actually fix this and get his reward, again, similar to the DJI security researcher, they just published all of every single interaction, every email, a timeline, the whole, every technical detail about the vulnerability, all of the communication interaction, everything that had happened between this researcher and Facebook and Instagram and Alex Stamos, everything that he published on this, this page. It's a pretty interesting blog post if you want to read it.